Okay, Chapter 10, The Return of the Lion. There's a bit of a picture, but it's hard to make out anything there, so it's not much point trying to understand it, but it looks like they're in the woods. So you remember they voted in Chapter 9 whether they were going to do what Lucy said because she saw Aslan, or they would go the other way, which seemed to make sense to them. And they decided to go the other way, not the way Lucy said. Did you think that was a good idea, or do you think they should have gone where Lucy said? We'll probably find out. The return of the lion. To keep along the edge of the gorge was not so easy as it had looked at the beginning. Before they'd gone many yards, they were confronted with young fir woods growing on the very edge, and after they'd tried to go through these, stooping and pushing for about 10 minutes, they realized that in there it would take them about an hour to do half a mile. So they came back and out again and decided to go around the fir wood. This took them much farther to their right than they wanted to go, far out of sight of the cliffs and out of the sound of the river, until they began to be afraid they'd lost it altogether. Nobody knew the time, but they knew it was getting to the hottest part of the day. When they were able at last to go back to the edge of the gorge, nearly a mile below the point from which they had started, they found the cliffs on their side of it a good deal lower and more broken. Soon they found a way down into the gorge and continued the journey at the river's edge, but first they had a rest and a long drink from the river. No one was talking anymore about breakfast or even dinner with Caspian. They may have been wise to stick to the rush instead of going along the top. It kept them sure of their direction, and ever since the fir wood, they'd all been afraid of being forced too far out of their course and losing themselves in the woods. It was an old and pathless forest, and you couldn't keep anything like a straight course in it. Patches of hopeless brambles, and fallen trees, and boggy places, and dense undergrowth would be always getting in your way. But the gorge of the Rush was not at all a nice place for traveling either. I mean, not a nice place for people in a hurry. For an afternoon's ramble ending in a picnic tea, it would have been just fine, but it had everything you wanted on an occasion like that. Rumbling waterfalls and silver cascades of water, deep amber-colored pools, mossy rocks and deep moss on the banks in which you could sink over your ankles, every kind of fern, jewel-like dragonflies, sometimes a hawk floating overhead. And once Peter and Trumpkin both thought they saw an eagle, but of course what the children and the dwarf wanted to see as soon as possible was the great river below them and Baruna and the way to Aslan's How. As they went on, the rush began to fall more and more steeply. Their journey became more and more of a climb and less of a walk. In places, even a dangerous climb over slippery rocks with a nasty drop into a dark chasm below them, and the river constantly roaring angrily at the bottom. You can be sure they watched the cliffs on their left eagerly for any sign of a break or any place where they could climb them, but those cliffs remained cruel and steep. It was maddening because everyone knew that if once they were out of the gorge on that side, they would have only a smooth slope and a fairly short walk to Caspian's headquarters. The boys and the dwarf were now in favor of lighting a fire and cooking their bear meat. Susan didn't want this. She only wanted, as she said, to get on and finish it and get out of these beastly woods. Lucy was far too tired and miserable to have any opinion about anything. But as there was no dry wood to be had, it mattered very little what anyone thought. There was going to be no fire no matter what. The boys began to wonder if raw meat was really as nasty as they had always been told. Trumpkin assured them that it was. Of course, if the children had attempted a journey like this a few days ago in England, they would have been all beat. They'd have been so tired they couldn't continue. I think I've explained before how Narnia was altering them. Even Lucy was, by now, so to speak, only 1/3 of a little girl going to boarding school for the first time, and 2/3 of Queen Lucy of Narnia. "Oh, at last," said Susan. "Oh, hooray," said Peter. The river gorge had just made a bend, and the whole view spread out beneath them. They could now see open country stretching before them to the horizon, and between it and them the broad silver ribbon of the great river. They could see the specially broad and shallow place which had once been the ford of Baruna, but was now spanned by long, many-arched bridge. There was a little town at the far end of the bridge. "By Jove," said Edmund, "we fought the Battle of Barona just where that town is." This cheered the boys more than anything. You can't help feeling stronger when you look at a place where you won a glorious victory, not to mention a kingdom hundreds of years ago. Peter and Edmund were soon so busy talking about the battle that they forgot their sore feet and the heavy drag of their mail shirts on their shoulders. The dwarf was interested too in hearing all about the battle. They were all getting on at a quicker pace now. The going became easier. Though there were still sheer cliffs on their left, the ground was becoming lower on their right, and soon it was no longer a gorge at all, only a valley. There were no more waterfalls, and presently they were in fairly thick anyways, woods again. Then all at once, whiz, and a sound rather like the stroke of a woodpecker. The children were still wondering where, ages ago, they had heard a sound just like that, and why they disliked it so when Trumpkin shouted, "Down!" at the same moment forcing Lucy, who happened to be right next to him, flat down into the bracken. Peter, who had been looking up to see if he could spot a squirrel, had seen what it was. A long, cruel arrow had sunk into a tree trunk just above his head. As he pulled Susan down and dropped himself, another came rasping over his shoulder and struck the ground at his side. "Quick, quick, get back, crawl," panted Trumpkin. So they all turned and wriggled along uphill as quickly and as quietly as they could under the bracken amid clouds of horribly buzzing flies. Suddenly arrows were whizzing all around them. One struck Susan's helmet with a sharp ping and glanced off and flew into the woods. They crawled quicker. Sweat poured off them. Then they ran when they were out of the dangerous area, stooping nearly double. The boys held their swords in their hands for fear they would trip them up. It was heartbreaking work, all uphill again, back over the ground they had already traveled, when they felt they really couldn't run anymore, even to save their lives. Finally, they all dropped down into the damp moss beside a waterfall and behind a big boulder, panting, all out of breath. They were surprised to see how high they had already gotten. They listened intently and could hear no sound of anyone chasing them. "So that's all right," said Trumpkin, drawing a deep breath. "They're not searching the wood. Only sentries, I expect, but it means that Miraz has an outpost down there. Bottles and baladors, it was a near thing." "I ought to have my head smacked for bringing us this way at all," said Peter. "On the contrary, your majesty," said the dwarf. "For one thing, it wasn't you. It was your royal brother, King Edmund, who first suggested going by Glasswater." "I'm afraid that DLF is right," said Edmund, who had quite honestly forgotten this ever since things began going wrong. "And for another," continued Trumpkin, "if we'd gone my way, we'd have walked straight into that new outpost, most likely, or at least had just the same trouble avoiding it. I think this Glasswater route has turned out for the best." "Well, a blessing in disguise," said Susan. "Yeah, some disguise," said Edmund. "I suppose we'll have to go right up the gorge again now," said Lucy. "Lou, you're a hero," said Peter. "That's the nearest thing you've got to saying 'I told you so.' But you didn't say it. Let's go on." "And as soon as we're well up into the forest," said Trumpkin, "whatever anyone says, I'm going to light a fire and cook some supper. But we must get well away from here first." Well, there's no need to describe how hard they worked to get back up the gorge. It was dreadfully hard work. But oddly enough, everyone felt more cheerful. They were getting their second wind, and the word supper had had a wonderful effect on them. They reached the fir-wood area, which had caused them so much trouble while it was still daylight, and they camped in a hollow just above it. It was tedious gathering any firewood, but it was grand when the fire blazed up and they began producing the damp and smeary parcels of bear meat which would have been so very unattractive to anyone who had spent the day indoors. The dwarf had splendid ideas about how to cook it. Each apple, they still had a few of these, was wrapped up in bear's meat as if it was to be apple dumpling with meat instead of pastry, only much thicker, and spiked on a sharp stick and then roasted. And the juice of the apple worked its way all through the meat, like applesauce almost with roast pork. Bear that has lived too much on other animals is not very nice, but bear that has had plenty of honey and fruit tastes excellent. And this turned out to be just that sort of bear. It was a truly glorious meal, and of course, no washing up, only lying back and watching the smoke from Trumpkin's pipe and stretching one's tired legs and chatting. Everyone felt quite hopeful now about finding King Caspian tomorrow and defeating Miraz in a few days. It may not have been sensible of them to feel like this, but they did. They dropped off to sleep one by one, but all of them pretty quickly. Lucy woke up out of the deepest sleep you can imagine with the feeling that the voice she liked best in the world had been calling her name. She thought at first it was her father's voice, but that didn't seem quite right. Then she thought it was Peter's voice, but no, that didn't fit either. She didn't feel like getting up, but not because she was still tired. On the contrary, she was wonderfully rested, and all her aches had gone from her bones, but because she felt so extremely happy and comfortable. She was looking straight up in the sky at the Narnian moon, which is larger than our moon, and she was looking at the starry sky, for the place where they had camped was comparatively open, not a lot of trees in the way, so that she could see the sky. Lucy, came the call again. No, that wasn't her father's voice or Peter's. Lucy? She sat up, trembling with excitement, but not with fear. The moon was so bright that the whole forest landscape around her was almost as clear as day, although it looked wilder. Behind her was the fir wood. Away to her right, the jagged cliff tops on the far side of the gorge. Straight ahead, open grass, to where a glade of trees began, about a bow shot away. Lucy looked very hard at the trees of that glade. Why, I do believe those trees are moving, she said to herself. They're walking around. She got up slowly, her heart beating wildly, and started walking towards them. There was certainly a noise in the glade, a noise such as trees make in a high wind, although there was no wind tonight. Yet it was not exactly an ordinary tree noise either. Lucy felt there was maybe a tune in it, but she couldn't catch the tune any more than she had been able to catch the words when the trees had so nearly talked to her the night before. But there was at least a lilt to it, almost like a song. She felt her own feet wanting to dance as she got nearer, and now there was no doubt that the trees really were moving in and out through one another as if in a complicated country dance. And I suppose, thought Lucy, when trees dance, it must be very, very country dance indeed. She was almost among them now. The first tree she looked at seemed at first glance to be not a tree at all, but a huge man with a shaggy beard and great bushes of hair. She was not frightened. She'd seen such things before. But then when she looked again, he was only a tree, although he was still moving. You couldn't see whether he had feet or roots, of course, because when trees move, they don't actually walk on the surface of the earth. They kind of wade in the earth as we do in water. Well, the same thing happened with every tree she looked at. At one moment, they seemed to be the friendly, lovely giant and giantess forms which the tree people put on when some good magic has called them into full life. Next moment, they all looked like trees again. But when they looked like trees, it was strangely human trees. And when they looked like people, it was like strangely branchy and leafy people. And, well, all the time that strange, lilting, rustling, cool, merry noise. They're almost awake, but not quite, said Lucy. She knew she herself was wide awake, wider than anyone usually is. She went fearlessly in among the trees, dancing herself as she leaped this way and that to avoid being run over by these huge dance partners. But she was only half interested in them. She wanted to get beyond them to something else, because it was from beyond them that the dear voice had called her name. She soon got through them, half wondering whether she had been using her arms to push branches aside or to hold hands in a great chain dance with big dancers who stooped to reach her. for they really were a ring of trees around a central open place. She stepped out from among their shifting confusion dance of lovely light and shadows. A circle of grass, smooth as a lawn, met her eyes, with dark trees dancing all around it. And then, oh joy, he was there, the huge lion, shining white in the moonlight with his huge black shadow underneath him. But for the movement of his tail, he might have been a stone lion. But Lucy never thought of that. She never stopped to think whether he was a friendly lion or not. She rushed to him as fast as she could go. She felt her heart would burst if she lost a moment. And the next thing she knew was that she was kissing him and putting her arms as far around his neck as she could reach and burying her face in his beautiful, rich, silky mane. Aslan, Aslan, dear Aslan, sobbed Lucy. At last. The great beast rolled over onto his side so that Lucy fell, half sitting and half lying between his front paws. He bent forward and just touched her nose with his tongue. His warm breath came all around her. She gazed up into his large, wise face. Welcome, child, he said. Aslan, said Lucy, you're bigger. That is because you're older, little one, answered he. Not because you are? I am not, but every year you grow, you will find me bigger. For a time she was so happy that she didn't want to speak, until eventually Aslan spoke. Lucy, he said, we must not lie here for long. You have work in hand, and much time has been lost today. Yes, wasn't it a shame, said Lucy. I saw you all right. They wouldn't believe me. They're all so... From somewhere deep inside Aslan's body, there came the faintest suggestion of a growl. I'm sorry, said Lucy, who understood some of his moods. I didn't mean to start slanging the others, but it wasn't my fault anyway, was it? The lion looked straight into her eyes. Oh, Aslan, said Lucy, you don't mean it was? How could I? Well, I couldn't have left the others and come up to you alone, could I? Well, don't look at me like that. Oh, well, I suppose I could have followed you, yes, and I wouldn't have been alone. You would have been there. I know, not if I was with you, I wouldn't have been alone, but what would have been the good? Aslan said nothing. You mean, said Lucy rather faintly, that it would have turned out all right somehow? But how? Please, Aslan, am I not to know how? To know what it would have happened, child, said Aslan. No, nobody has ever told what would have happened. Oh dear, said Lucy. But anyone can find out what will happen, said Aslan. If you go back to the others now and wake them up and tell them you have seen me again and that you must all get up at once and follow me, what will happen? There's only one way of finding out. Do you mean that is what you want me to do? Gasped Lucy. Yes, little one, said Aslan. Well, will the others see you too? Asked Lucy. Certainly not at first, said Aslan. Later on, it depends. But they won't believe me, said Lucy. It doesn't matter, said Aslan. Oh dear, said Lucy. And well, I was so pleased at finding you again, and I thought you'd let me stay, and I thought you'd come roaring in and frighten all the enemies away like last time, and now everything is going to be horrid. It is hard for you, little one, said Aslan, but things never happen the same way twice. It has been hard for us all in Narnia before now. Lucy buried her head in his mane to hide from his face. But there must have been magic in his mane, because she could feel lion strength going into her. Quite suddenly she sat up. I'm sorry, Aslan, she said. I'm ready now. Now you are a lioness, said Aslan, and now all Narnia will be renewed. But come, we have no time to lose. He got up and walked with stately, noiseless paces back to the belt of dancing trees through which she had just come. and Lucy went with him, laying a rather tremulous, trembling hand on his mane. The trees parted to let them through, and for 1 second they assumed their human forms completely. Lucy had a glimpse of tall and lovely wood gods and wood goddesses all bowing to the lion. Next moment they were trees again, but still bowing, with such graceful sweeps of branch and trunk that their bowing was itself a kind of dance. "Now, child," said Aslan when they had left the trees behind them, "I will wait here. Go and wake the others and tell them to follow. If they will not, then you at least must follow me alone." Well, it is a terrible thing to have to wake 4 people, all older than yourself and all very tired, for the purpose of telling them something they probably won't believe and making them do something they certainly won't like. "I mustn't think about it. I must just do it," thought Lucy. She went to Peter first and shook him. "Peter," she whispered in his ear, "wake up, quick. Aslan is here. He says we've got to follow him at once." "Certainly, Lou. Whatever you like," said Peter unexpectedly. Well, this was encouraging, but as Peter instantly rolled around and went to sleep again, it wasn't much use. Then she tried Susan. Susan did really wake up, but only to say in her most annoying grown-up voice, "You've been dreaming, Lucy. Go to sleep again." So she tackled Edmund next. It was very difficult to wake him up, but when at last she had done it, he was really awake, and he sat up. "Eh?" he said in a grumpy voice. What are you talking about, Lucy?" So she said it all over again to him. This was one of the worst parts of her job, for each time she said it, it sounded less convincing. "Aslan," said Edmund, jumping up. "Hooray! Where?" Lucy turned back to where she could see the lion waiting, his patient eyes fixed upon her. "Right there," she said, pointing. Where?" asked Edmund again. "Well, right there, don't you see? Just this side of the trees." Edmund stared hard for a while and then said, "No, there's nothing there. You've got dazzled and muzzled with the moonlight. One does, you know. I thought I saw something for a moment myself, but it's only an optical, I can see him all the time," said Lucy. "He's looking straight at us." "Well, then why can't I see him?" "He said you might not be able to see him." "Why?" "I don't know. That's just what he said." "Oh, bother it all," said Edmund. "I do wish you wouldn't keep on seeing things, but I suppose we'll have to wake the others." And that's the end of chapter 10. Chapter 11, though, and they found Aslan. Is that exciting or what? Chapter 11 is called The Lion Roars. The Lion Roars. So make sure you come back for that one.